There are nights in Las Vegas that follow the plan exactly, and there are nights that don't. The nights that don't follow the plan are the only ones anyone remembers. This is about one of those nights. It was 1970. Tom Jones was mid-residency at the Flamingo Hotel. The show had been running for weeks. Each night was a repeat of the night before, not in the sense of diminishing quality, but in the sense of established excellence. The set list was fixed, the production was tight. The musicians knew every cue before it was given. Tom Jones had performed the same program enough times that his body could deliver it without conscious instruction. That is what a residency does to a performer. It makes the technical execution automatic, freeing the mind for something else. For Tom Jones, that something else was the room. Because no two rooms are the same, even when they are technically the same room. The same showroom, the same stage, the same lighting design, but a different crowd every night. And each crowd had its own texture, its own temperature, its own specific relationship to what was happening on stage. He had learned to read that texture. It was one of the skills that the industry could not teach and the training programs did not cover. The audience knew what they were coming for, but the audience that night had something in it that the set list had not planned for. One voice, coming from somewhere in the dark of the midsection, between the stage lighting and the back of the room. Not a stage direction, not the kind of crowd noise that performers learn to absorb and continue through. Something that Tom Jones heard differently. Something that made him stop. In more than 15 years of live performance, Tom Jones had heard every type of audience reaction. He had heard the roar of a crowd that had been waiting for a specific song. He had heard the quiet that descends when a ballad reaches its peak and nobody wants to disturb it. He had heard laughter between songs. He had heard requests shouted across the floor. He had heard the small, private sounds of people in the dark who thought they couldn't be heard. The whispers, the sighs, the quiet words exchanged at tables close enough to the stage to carry. He had learned to read all of it the way a sailor reads weather. Not analytically, not consciously, but instinctively, from a density of experience that had become faster than thought and more reliable than intention. That night, he heard something different, and he stopped. Tom Jones stopped singing. The band, trained to follow him, stopped a beat later. The sudden quiet was something the room noticed, not with alarm, but with the particular attention that a room pays when a performer departs from the expected sequence. Tom Jones looked toward the midsection of the room. The house lights were low. He could not see clearly, but he could speak into the darkness. He said, "I heard you." A ripple moved through the room. Not laughter exactly, the sound of a crowd that is suddenly aware that something unrehearsed is happening. He said it again, more gently. "I heard what you said." A pause. Then he said, "And I'd like to sing it again." He nodded to the band. They found the beginning of the song again. He sang the whole thing from the start. This time, differently. Not differently in tempo or key or arrangement, differently in the specific quality of attention that a performer brings to a song when they understand, mid-performance, that it has reached someone in a way that went beyond entertainment. He sang it as if the woman in the midsection was the only person in the room. His attention aimed at the dark midsection where the voice had come from. Not performatively, not turning his body to the midsection in a theatrical gesture of inclusiveness. Something more internal, something in the quality of the voice itself. The way a voice changes when it stops performing for a crowd and starts speaking to a specific person. The difference is audible. Most audiences cannot name it, but they feel it. And somehow, in the way that happens in the best performances, by singing it for one person, he sang it for every person. When it ended the second time, the room was quiet for a moment that was longer than the usual pause between a performance and its applause. Not stunned, not confused, simply held. The way a room is held when something has happened inside it that was not on the program and cannot be fully explained and will take some time to settle. Tom Jones moved on to the next song. It would have been easy to turn what had happened into a moment, to address it explicitly, to name it for the audience in a way that converted it into entertainment. A small story to tell between songs, a managed anecdote that demonstrated warmth and connection. He did not do that. He did not address what had happened. He did not turn it into a story to be told. He did not frame it for the audience in a way that made it a moment to be acknowledged and filed and moved past. He simply went on. The band followed him. The show continued. But the room was different after that. Not dramatically different, not in a way that anyone who arrived 5 minutes later would have detected. But to the people who had been there for the moment, who had heard the voice from the dark, and heard Tom Jones stop, and heard him say, "I heard you," something had happened that the rest of the evening was simply allowed to follow. The Flamingo in 1970 was not the largest showroom in Las Vegas, but it was one of the most storied. It had been there since the late 1940s, when Bugsy Siegel had built it on an idea about what the Nevada desert could become. It had hosted Nat King Cole and Ella Fitzgerald and Tony Bennett. It had a particular kind of intimacy for a room that size, the tables close enough to the stage that performers could see the faces in the front rows and feel the room in the way a smaller venue allows. Tom Jones had been playing rooms like this long enough to understand their mathematics. How many tables? What kind of crowd? Whether the room was warm before he started, or whether it needed to be woken. That night, the room was warm. The crowd was the kind of Las Vegas crowd that 1970 produced, formally dressed, well-attended, composed of people who had planned the evening in advance and arrived expecting to have a specific kind of time. They were not the loud variety of audience. They were the kind that signaled appreciation through sustained quiet and sustained attention. The kind that is, in its way, more demanding than the loud variety. Because sustained attention is harder to earn than noise. Halfway through the first set, Tom Jones was in the middle of a song. Not one of the famous ones. A mid-set number. The kind of song that serves the arc of a show without being its peak. That carries the audience from one emotional place to another without announcing itself as a landmark. He was singing it the way he sang things in this period, with full commitment, without marking it as less important than the bigger numbers. Because in Tom Jones's understanding of performance, no song in a set was allowed to be unimportant. Every song was the only song the audience got right now. And right now was all that mattered. He was mid-phrase when he heard it, a woman's voice somewhere in the dark of the midsection of the room. Not a shout, not a request, something quieter. Something that was not technically addressed to the stage at all. Something that sounded like a woman saying something she needed to say, quietly, to the person sitting beside her. A private word, a moment of internal response to what she was hearing made briefly external. Said at the exact moment when the room was quiet enough that the voice on stage could hear it. Not the whole room, not the people at the surrounding tables. The person standing at the microphone 40 feet away, in the particular stillness that a performer occupies in the middle of a song, when all their attention is trained on the sound coming out of them and the space receiving it. Tom Jones heard it, and for a moment, a fraction of a second, the calculation he made was not a performer's calculation. It was the calculation of someone who had grown up in rooms where music was not entertainment but communication, where a song was a thing you sent out and a person received. Where receiving it, actually receiving it, in the body and the chest, and whatever part of a person is closest to what they cannot say aloud, was the whole point. Tom Jones was asked about the audience in later interviews more often than he was asked about almost anything else. Not the crowds as a statistical phenomenon, not the scale of the attendance or the demographics of the listening public. The individuals. He was asked repeatedly whether he was aware of specific people in the audience while performing, whether he could see them across the footlights, whether they registered as individuals rather than as a collective mass of attention. His answer was consistent. He said, "You can always tell when a song reaches someone. It changes the room. Even in a room of 2,000 people, one person receiving something genuinely changes the air." He was not speaking mystically. He was speaking from observation, from the experience of standing on a stage several thousand times and learning to read the specific texture of a room's attention, learning to feel the difference between an audience that is watching and an audience that is receiving. That night at the Flamingo, he had felt the difference. A song had reached someone, and instead of acknowledging it privately and continuing, instead of filing it as a good moment and moving through to the next cue, he had stopped. He had said, "I heard you." He had sung it again. The woman in the midsection of the room never came forward. Nobody who was at that show has publicly identified themselves as the person Tom Jones stopped for. That is, in its own way, part of what makes the night notable. The moment was not leveraged. It was not used for publicity. It was not turned into a story that served someone's career or reputation or commercial interest. It simply happened. Between a performer and a person in the dark, and the room witnessed it. That is rare. In a business built on the careful management of how things appear, on the exact calculation of spontaneity, on the precise staging of authentic-seeming moments, on the rehearsal of unrehearsed-seeming interactions, a genuinely unmanaged moment between a performer and a stranger in the dark is rare. It is rare because it cannot be planned for. It requires a performer to abandon, briefly, the managed version of themselves that professional performance demands, to step outside the set list and the production and the contract and respond to something simply because it was real and they heard it. That is what Tom Jones did at the Flamingo in 1970, not as a decision that had been calculated in advance. As an instinct that had been trained across 15 years of performances in rooms where the distance between the performer and the audience was close enough that neither party could pretend the other wasn't there. It is what audiences remember for 50 years when they cannot easily explain what they are remembering. Not the songs they had come to hear, not the production values of a well-funded Las Vegas residency, not the technical precision of a band that had played together through 100 performances of the same set. The moment a performer stopped in the middle of a song, on a stage in Las Vegas, said to the dark room, "I heard you," and sang it again, from the beginning, for one person who had not known anyone was listening. Tom Jones left the Flamingo stage that night, the way he left every stage, through the wings, into the corridor, back to himself. He did not know the woman's name. He did not know what had moved her. He knew only what he had heard from the stage, and what he had chosen to do with it. In Las Vegas, in 1970, in the middle of a set that had been planned to the minute and rehearsed until it ran without effort, a person in the dark had said something, and the performer had heard her. That is not a small thing. It never was.